What is ancestor veneration and what is its connection with Daoism or CCT?
Concern over maintaining the integrity of one's connections with family. Lineage is one of the hallmarks of Chinese religious and social life. Members of each family line male descendants from a shared ancestor, with wives attached to their husband's line, acknowledge both the continued spiritual presence and the sacredness of their forebears. Their reasons are many: expression of grief, assistance of the deceased in his or her struggles beyond the grave, the desire for blessings, feeling a sense of family cohesiveness, showing continued affection for the dead. Long after the funeral and an extended period of official mourning, families pay homage to the dead both at the cemetery and at the ancestral shrine in the home. There, on the altar table, the family preserves a set of tablets, each with the name of one deceased relative inscribed on it. In very wealthy families of times past, the oldest son would dedicate his life to looking after the proper performance of the rites, foregoing virtually all other activities. For most families today, ongoing activities include chiefly the regular visits to the cemetery, annual refurbishment of the grave for the feast called Clear and Bright, Qingming, and daily prayers at the home shrine. At home, family members make the same kinds of symbolic offerings to the ancestors as to the deities enshrined on the domestic altar. Very wealthy families have often built special ancestral temples as major monuments to the spiritual power of the dead. Few, if any, of these practices or specific concerns are uniquely Daoist. It is all part of the broadly Chinese religious patrimony, with some elements perhaps more closely linked to CCT than to any specific major tradition.
Does that mean Hindus do not believe in heaven or hell?
Traditional Hindu cosmologies speak of three realms of existence or lokas. One scheme describes an in-between realm, Antarloka, where individual souls abide both during sleep and between incarnations. This reflects the persistence of important features of ancient Vedic views of the cosmos. A version of hell called Naraka, literally, referring to humankind, is a thoroughly unpleasant lower part of the Antarloka that functions rather like a purgatory. In any of its 7, or even as many as 21 levels, souls can overcome through suffering some of the effects of bad karma. A multi-leveled region called Anandloka, realm of bliss, also called Svarga, region of light, is roughly equivalent to a paradise or heaven. It is a temporary abode in which people who have died approaching liberation acquire knowledge that can assist them toward greater spiritual progress in their next life. Hindu cosmology includes multiple levels, both in this in-between realm and in the uppermost realms beyond that reserved for those who have achieved moksha. Most Hindus regard the intermediate equivalents of heaven and hell as temporary. Although some smaller sects teach the existence of more or less permanent abodes of punishment in the next life.
What is a denomination?
The term denomination came into common use in religious studies in reference to the various Christian churches that came into being during the Protestant Reformation. But we can also make appropriate use of the term in reference to developments in other traditions. In general, denominations differ from one another, primarily on organizational rather than doctrinal grounds. Members of one denomination therefore do not generally consider members of others as religiously wrong-headed. It is nevertheless not uncommon for denominations to develop distinctive features of religious practice and expression, so that over many centuries one comes to differ from another in more than just structure and governance. Some scholars also take the view that denominations are inspired by a spirit of thoroughgoing reform and are far more than mere organizational variants. In addition, some denominations have sometimes formed along the lines of ethnicity or socio-economic stratification. Denominations nevertheless tend to remain somewhat more inclusive in their criteria for membership than sects, retaining some of the openness characteristic of the larger or parent organizations from which they originated.
Are there any important links between the Quran and the Bible?
Since the Islamic interpretation of history overlaps in significant ways with those of Judaism and Christianity, one should not be surprised to find that some material in the Quran parallels some biblical material. Some narrative treatments of various biblical patriarchs and kings, whom the Quran identifies as prophets and messengers, immediately recall aspects of biblical accounts. But there are also interesting variations in the stories. Adam and Eve's fall, for example, is connected with eating from a forbidden tree, or an ear of wheat in one version. Sprinkled throughout the scripture are references to Abraham's near sacrifice of his son, whom Islamic tradition takes to be Ishmael rather than Isaac, and to Moses' mission to Pharaoh, David's musical gifts, Solomon's royal grandeur, and others. Perhaps the single most important parallel is the story of Joseph. Surah 12 of the Quran retells the tale found in Genesis 39-50 with its own distinctive flavor and variations in detail. Only Joseph's story is told in its entirety, and all in a single surah dedicated entirely to it. Though many Jewish and Christian readers often conclude that Muhammad borrowed from the Bible, that is not necessarily the case. The way the Quran tells the stories, mostly in short excerpts and allusions, suggests that Muhammad's listeners must have been already familiar with at least the general drift of the narratives. There are also some accounts of non-biblical prophetic figures, called Hud, Saleh, and Shu'ab, in some ways unique to the Arabian Peninsula. It is important to note that Muslim tradition has discerned in both the Old and New Testaments references to the coming of Islam's prophet. God promised to raise up for Israel a prophet like Moses, Deuteronomy 18:18, Muhammad. The prophet Isaiah sees two riders approaching, one on a donkey and the other on a camel, Jesus and Muhammad. Jesus promised to send a Parakletos, advocate, John 14:16. But Muslim commentators argue that with the correct vowels, the Greek word is parakletos, meaning highly praised, the exact meaning of Muhammad in Arabic.
If I visited a Confucian temple, what would I see?
Major Confucian temples are arranged along the same general lines as traditional Buddhist and many CCT temples, all influenced by the plan of the imperial residence. Simple but elegant formality sets the Confucian temples apart from the others. Most Confucian temples greet the outside world through a main gate on the south side of the surrounding outer walls. Here is what you would see if you visited the Confucian Temple in Taipei, Taiwan, whose plan is unique by reason of local tradition. Through either the eastern or western portals, you enter a garden with a pond. The high walls recall the Master's parable comparing great teachings to unscalable ramparts that preserve the building's secrecy, so that one must work to gain entry through the door. From there you pass through doors on either side of the main gate into a forecourt that offers further opportunity to shift mental gears before approaching the heart of the temple. Local tradition has it that there the main south gate must remain closed to all but those scoring highest on imperial exams, since no one from the region ever achieved that rank. The south gate remains closed except for special occasions. Walking northward you pass through the Gate of Rites into the main courtyard, surrounded by rooms built into the outer walls. Immediately inside the inner gate you find yourself in one or another of the temple's study rooms.
What other early schools and scriptures are especially important in the history of Buddhism?
A number of early Buddhist schools or denominations arose in India during the 5 or 6 centuries after the Buddha's death. One cluster, known collectively as the Hinayana, small vehicle, schools, developed as a result of differing interpretations of what manner of being the Buddha was. The most important of these schools is the Theravada, wisdom of the elders, the branch largely responsible for the Pali Canon. Theravada Buddhists taught that the Buddha was a historical human being who counseled others to pursue their own path to enlightenment. But some Buddhists incline toward more expansive, spiritual interpretation. The Mahasanghikas, proponents of the Great Assembly, taught that the Buddha's many previous lives as a Buddha to be a bodhisattva. Prior to his birth as Siddhartha Gautama meant that the Buddha was more of a cosmic spiritual being than a mere mortal. All but one volume of their sizable Sanskrit, called Buddhist hybrid, scriptures have been lost. Another school, the Sarvastivadins, proponents of the view that all exists, further emphasized the importance of the bodhisattva's spiritual evolution as a model of growth in virtue. They, too, produced a body of sacred writing. But the Sanskrit originals were lost, and we know of them through Chinese and Tibetan translations. Next to the Theravada school, the most important of the early denominations was the Mahayana, Great Vehicle. So called because of its wider appeal. Mahayana teaching emphasized the larger-than-life qualities of the Buddha. More than a mere mortal, the Buddha was a saving figure whose compassion filled the universe and whose grace was available to all who asked. Mahayana scriptures in Sanskrit included sutras claiming to be the Buddha's own words, commentaries and treatises called shastras, and esoteric works called tantras used by smaller sects.
Are music and dance important in Christian religious ritual?
Almost all Christian churches make music an important element in worship, and a few engage in various forms of prayer-related movement. In some non-liturgical churches, singing and dancing form the majority of congregational worship, even to the point of having music accompany the preaching. Individual hymns, some lasting 10 to 15 minutes or more, are the largest feature in those cases, punctuated by prayer and testimony from the assembled worshippers. In other words, songs and preaching make up most of the order of service. Liturgical traditions use the hymn form, but also sing set pieces of the liturgical ritual itself. For example, the Holy, Holy, Holy announces the beginning of the Eucharistic prayer, and the Lamb of God is sung just before communion in the Western liturgical tradition. Since the liturgical traditions strive for an atmosphere of greater solemnity, they tend to incorporate dancing less often, and then only of a rather restrained kind. In many non-liturgical churches, the expression of feeling is a major component, so that one can expect to find much more animated movement in such settings. More staid and stately liturgical traditions have historically preferred the majestic sonorities of the pipe organ, occasionally joined by brass, woodwinds, or classical strings. In other traditions, piano is the primary instrument, and even small congregations may feature bands with electric guitar and other keyboards, bass, and full drum kit. In most Eastern Christian traditions, however, liturgical services are chanted without any musical accompaniment. Christians communities all over the world naturally make use of distinctive ethnic and local musical styles and instruments.
Why is Mecca a holy city for Muslims?
Mecca, in western Saudi Arabia, is the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, c. 570, and was his home until the year 622, when those who opposed him forced him to flee to Medina, a city about 200 miles north of Mecca. Muhammad later returned to Mecca and died there in 632. Mecca is also the site of the Great Mosque, which is situated in the heart of the city. The outside of the mosque is an arcade, made up of a series of arches enclosing a courtyard. In that courtyard is the most sacred shrine of Islam, the Kaaba, a small stone building that contains the black stone, which Muslims believe was sent from heaven by Allah, God. When Muslims pray, 5 times a day, according to the 5 pillars of faith, they face the Kaaba. It is also the destination of the Hajj, or pilgrimage.
Do all Jews belong to the same large group?
Jews have formed a number of important sub-communities throughout their history. Though there are generally fewer formally constituted denominations, sects, or other subgroups in Judaism than in most other major traditions. That is quite remarkable, considering the relatively small global population of Jews and the enormous diversity of cultures in which Jews now live. Major differences among Jewish communities appear most frequently in the relative strictness of ritual observance. Variations in theological views are also noteworthy in some cases, but they are less critical. Strictest in observance are Orthodox Jews, with conservative communities somewhat less strict. Further removed from the nearly all-inclusive adherence to biblical and traditional practices stands Reform Judaism. And most flexible of all, both doctrinally and ritually, are the Reconstructionists.
Is there a central Shinto teaching authority?
Shinto's close identification over the centuries with Japanese culture and imperial rule has sometimes made it appear that the royal administration functioned as a central religious authority. Certain regimes have made concerted efforts to encourage uniformity of traditional thinking among the Japanese people, and that has sometimes involved official statements about Shinto beliefs as well as attempts to centralize the organization of large numbers of shrines. In addition, training for Shinto ritual specialists in recent times has devolved on only a select few educational institutions very much associated with national identity. Those academic religious organizations have set themselves the task of clarifying and, in some cases, restructuring the countless elements of ancient Shinto tradition into a coherent system. Theirs has been an increasingly theological enterprise in modern times. Even so, Shinto tradition has remained quite fluid and inclusive, and far less identified with definitive teaching authority than, say, Roman Catholicism. Over the centuries, various centralized institutions have come and gone. The Institute of the Great Teaching, Daikyoin, for example, was motivated largely by the desire to root out Buddhist and Christian influences in 19th century Japan. The Bureau of Divinity, Jinjikan, sought to unify the administration of shrines and the appointment of priests. It is perhaps best to think of the centralized authority as regulating matters of practice rather than of belief, setting out detailed instructions for rituals, Jinjia Shaishiki, and for coordinating observances nationally.
What is a mandala? Is it the same as a thanka?
Mandala is a Sanskrit word for circle. As a two-dimensional design, a mandala is equivalent to the plan of a stupa. Viewed directly from above, a stupa reveals a series of alternating concentric square and circular shapes. From the outside in, you see the square foundation, the circular earth mound, the square altar inside its square railing, and finally the circular discs mounted on the shaft of the spire. Some mandalas depict 4 gates on the sides of the foundation square and add yet another outer circle symbolizing the 8 cemeteries through which a meditator must first pass, becoming oblivious to the senses and all other distractions before entering the sacred space. Vajrayana and other esoteric Buddhist sects adapted this bird's-eye perspective on the stupa and interpreted it as an image of both the macrocosm, the whole spiritual cosmos, and the microcosm, the individual meditator. Devotees meditate on the sacred design of the spiritual city as they move symbolically inward from the gates toward the center and enlightenment. Various deities and forms of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are depicted in the different spaces of the mandala, each symbolizing some aspect of spiritual power. Tibetan monks sometimes create large mandalas using grains of colored sand. After many hours of work, they conduct rituals around it and then discard it in a river as a reminder of impermanence and non-attachment. Thanka is a more generic term for a Tibetan wall hanging depicting a religious theme. Some thankas depict mandalas, and some display sacred imagery of other kinds. Multiple scenes illustrating Jataka tales offer material designed for meditation on essential virtues modeled by the Buddha to be
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise for Jews?
Attitudes to interfaith marriages vary a great deal among Jews. It is probably fair to say that the preference of most would be that their sons and daughters marry other Jews. But resistance to interfaith marriage is certainly stronger among Orthodox and conservative Jews than among Reform. Virtually complete prohibition of interfaith marriages in some Jewish communities arises less out of concern for ethnic purity as such than out of a desire to prevent the faith tradition from being irreversibly diluted. Experience has shown that families in which the parents are not both Jewish are less likely to educate their children in the Jewish tradition. Tradition lost is extremely difficult to recover, especially in cultures and societies that seem to value the new much more highly than anything with deep historical roots. Even the musical Fiddler on the Roof goes a long way toward helping non-Jews to appreciate the beauty and centrality of tradition. Tradition, for Jews, families are the first line of defense against the permanent loss, not just of a collection of ritual deeds performed mechanically, but of the meaning of life itself as interpreted from a Jewish perspective.
What is appropriate behavior?
The fourth truth says simply, to stop inappropriate craving, and follow the eightfold noble path.
What are the major festivities historically associated with CIT?
Each year on the day before the winter solstice, the emperor and his retinue visited the temple of heaven for an elaborate event. When paying homage to heaven and earth, the emperor would perform special gestures of humility by kneeling 3 times and prostrating himself 9 times. When he sacrificed to other powers, such as the sun, the moon, and the gods with power over the forces of nature, the emperor did not perform those rituals of self-abasement. At the Forbidden City's Hall of Supreme Harmony, major sacred events included the enthronement of a new emperor, royal weddings, an event held every 10 years called the Great Anniversary, announcement of results of civil service examinations, and celebrations of the winter solstice and New Year. In the Hall of Middle Harmony, the emperor formulated decrees to be made public in royal temples at all the various seasonal festivities. Imperial officials designated by the emperor, or local administrators in the case of smaller events, took care of the regular agriculturally significant occasions throughout the country.
What is meant by the phrase resurrection of the body?
Christians believe that all who have died will rise again. When Jesus Christ comes in glory at the end of the world, humanity's rising will be patterned on the resurrection of Jesus. He who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. 2 Corinthians 4:14. Christians believe that human beings are called not to be simply souls or spirits, but to be fully alive, in body and in soul. Thus, the entire human person, body and soul, is destined to share eternal life with God in heaven.
How and when do Jews celebrate Passover, Pesach?
Celebrated Nisan 15 to 22, a day longer outside of Israel, Passover, Pesach. Is a spring festival commemorating God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt. The rebirth of nature recalls the birth of Israel as a people. Specifically, its imagery derives from the belief that God instructed the Israelites to mark their doorposts with the blood of the sacrificial lamb. When God sent an angel to strike dead the firstborn of all the Egyptians, the angel would pass over the houses of the Israelites. The biblical account appears in Exodus 11 to 12. During the observance of the Passover Seder. Order of service, participants recount the story in the Haggadah Shel Pesach. Celebrating with unleavened bread and wine. Participants begin by blessing the wine and washing their hands. They then dip a vegetable into salt water and eat it, recalling the Red Sea. They then break the second of 3 pieces of bread, matzah, and hide it for the children to search out later, in recollection of hunger and divine manna in the desert. After recounting the story of the Exodus, they drink a second cup of wine and wash their hands again. Blessing the bread, they eat the first piece and what remains of the second piece. They eat some bitter herbs, recalling the suffering of the slaves in Egypt, then dip some herbs into charozet, a paste of spices, wine, matzah, and fruit, symbolizing the mortar the former slaves made for Pharaoh. The main meal is followed by eating the hidden part of the second matzah, and by a final blessing and a third cup of wine. The celebration closes with a psalm of praise and another cup of wine.
Is there an Islamic creed?
One short, 2-part statement sums up the essentials of Muslim belief. I confess that there is no deity but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. In this testimony called the Shahada, confession or witnessing, Muslims affirm the 2 foundational elements from which all other beliefs and practices flow. First, they assert that only the one, transcendent, Supreme Being called Allah in Arabic can claim the full allegiance of humankind. Allah means literally the deity, or what ordinary English usage calls God with a capital G. Allah is therefore not a distinct name for God as such, but the primary designation for the Absolute. The deity above all other powers both spiritual and worldly. Affirming God's absolute oneness is called Tawhid, pronounced Tawheed, second. Muslims attest that human beings know of this Supreme Being through the agency of prophets, the last of whom was Muhammad. This profession of faith is the first of the 5 pillars of Islam. Along with almsgiving, daily ritual prayer, fasting during Ramadan pronounced Ramadan, and pilgrimage to Mecca. All of which will be discussed later in detail. Muslim religious scholars between about 750 and 950 formulated a number of other, more detailed creedal statements. But none has been as widely known as the Nicene Creed among Christians or the 13 Articles among Jews. Those later Islamic creeds developed largely as correctives to theological positions that arose during Islam's early centuries, views that the creeds formally repudiated as unacceptable.
What is the difference between a sign and a symbol?
In general terms, a sign is any verbal or visual indicator that conveys some basic message. The capital letter P inside a circle, crossed out by a diagonal bar, has become a widely understood indicator for no parking. It conveys no additional meaning. In the language of religious studies, a sign is an object or an action that communicates a specific religious meaning. Members of any tradition grow up learning the language of their tradition's system of signs. Gestures and implements employed in ritual comprise one of the most common categories. A bow, a knee bent to touch the floor, a clap of the hands, a lighted candle. All can function as signs suggesting a certain mood or atmosphere. Objects and actions used this way do not necessarily carry complex meanings. Some objects and actions, however, do communicate more specialized and even arcane messages. A symbol is an object or act that represents some reality other than itself. Most religious traditions use symbols to remind believers of the central realities of the faith. Sometimes because that reality is considered too sacred to depict, and sometimes because it is simply easier to use the shorthand of symbolism. Symbolism can be economical in many ways since it can pack a great deal of meaning into a small, often inexpensive, item. Visual symbols are called an aniconic form of expression when they use a non-representational image to refer to a sacred personage. So, for example, the fish symbolizes Christ, the empty throne or riderless horse the Buddha.
Have relics ever been important for Muslims?
Popular Islamic spirituality in many parts of the world has included devotional practices associated with the tombs of holy persons. People visit the shrines of the friends of God in hopes of gaining blessings and other special favors as a result of saintly intercession. Many of these shrines hold items the saint is believed to have owned, such as headgear, a special symbolic frock called the kurka, walking staff, begging bowl, prayer beads, or symbolic weapon. Devotees who come to the shrines sometimes receive an object, such as a simple head wrapping or other token, that has been in contact with the holy person's tomb. Only one object has been similarly associated with Muhammad. Since the 13th century, Turkish Muslims believed they owned the so-called mantle of the Prophet, a green robe now in the possession of the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul. People there and in many other countries still recite a traditional poem called the Burda. Mantle poem, during the observance of Muhammad's birthday. But the mantle itself has never been the focus of devotional practice, as have the relics of many friends of God. Sacred footprints function in Islamic tradition, as in many others as well, like relics. Pilgrims to Mecca say special prayers at the Station of Abraham just opposite the door of the Kaaba. A small glass and gold-colored cupola covers a small stone said to contain footprints God caused Abraham to leave in the softened stone as a proof of his prophethood. Tradition says that as Muhammad rose heavenward on his ascension, he left still visible prints in the large stone beneath the dome of the rock. Muhammad's footprints became the inspiration for several types of visual symbolism still popular in North Africa, for example. Footprints of Ali have likewise been at the devotional center of a number of shrines.
How would you sum up the history of Confucianism?
During the first couple of centuries after the time of Confucius, two major thinkers developed the beginnings of what we now call Confucianism. Mencius, or Mengzi, 371 to 289 BCE, and Sunzi, d. 215 BCE, codified the teachings of the master into the foundations of a political philosophy. Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, 221 to 210 BCE, displeased with the emerging movement, tried to suppress it by burning all the Confucian texts. Before that emperor died, in 210 BCE, he had succeeded in transforming feudal China into a centralized bureaucracy, but Confucianism survived. Under the new Han dynasty, 206 BCE to 20 CE, the state espoused Confucianism as its core ideology. Confucianism took institutional shape as a system for training the empire's bureaucrats and officials, thereby strengthening the cultural elite known as the literati. For the next several centuries, Confucianism's prestige dwindled as Buddhism's star rose with increasing imperial patronage. During the southern and northern, 265 to 581 CE, Sui, 581 to 618, and Tang dynasties, 618 to 906, Confucian ritual and literati authority held on criticizing Buddhism as an insidious import and enjoying sporadic periods of notoriety. Confucianism returned to prominence during the Song dynasty. 960-1279, as a result of the Neo-Confucian revival. Scholars finalized the canon of the 5 classics and 4 books, plus several subsidiary works. Official Neo-Confucian philosophies drifted away from traditional beliefs in a transcendent divine heaven, emphasizing ethics and social responsibility. But a cult centered around Confucius survived. During the last of the Chinese dynasties, the Qing, or Manchu, 1644 to 1911. A generally strong literati class continued to promote an increasingly static and dogmatic form of Confucian orthodoxy. The last emperor fell with the arrival of Sun Yat-sen's new republic, and the literati became functionally obsolete. Still, the leaders of the republic held Confucius up as the epitome of Chinese culture. when Mao Zedong's communist movement began its rise in the 1930s. The chairman declared himself fed up with Confucius and the old ways. In response, the Republican nationalist movement insisted that Confucianism represented all genuinely Chinese values. As the nationalists fled the mainland and established themselves in Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, overt acknowledgement of Confucian tradition went with them.
Who are Theravada Buddhists?
Theravada Buddhists are members of a more or less homogeneous community of faith and worship built around the notion that the Buddha was a human being who taught by example. The historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was the last of many non-human and human reincarnations of the Buddha to be a separate school from the Second Council on in the 4th century BCE. Their main scriptures are called collectively the Pali Canon. Theravadins seek deliverance from rebirth by eliminating craving and ignorance through self-discipline. The ideal and model of the enlightened life is the Arhat. Arhats benefit others chiefly by their example, and they possess no saving power as such. They embody primarily the virtue of wisdom. Their ultimate goal, nirvana, is a state beyond this world of samsara in which the liberated person experiences neither desire nor impressions of any kind. Theravada sources describe nirvana as a permanent pleasant state of knowledge, freedom, and peace that is largely the result of a process of personal effort. When Theravadins pray, their primary intent is more to honor the Buddha than to worship him. All good acts, including religious ritual, done with proper intent can help one gain merit toward the eradication of negative karma. For most Theravada Buddhists, the concepts of merit making and merit transfer are more basic and accessible than the kind of lofty ethical and spiritual discipline embodied in an Arhat. There are, of course, some regional and cultural variations in Theravada expression and practice, but considerably less so than in the other main branches of Buddhist tradition.
What is a fakir?
Fakir has become a widely used term generally disconnected from its original meaning. It comes from the Arabic word fakir, meaning poor person or beggar in other words. Someone who chooses spiritual and sometimes also material poverty. By extension, fakir has come to refer to a class of individuals, especially in Western and Southern Asia, who engage in shocking and apparently painful physical actions without suffering disastrous consequences. Fakirs capture attention precisely by their ability to come away seemingly unscathed by lying on beds of nails, walking on live coals, eating glass, piercing parts of the body without drawing blood, and similar bizarre actions. In India, the term can also be a reference to perfectly credible and authentic renunciants called sannyas who show no penchant for outlandish display. But the shift of meaning from Sufi mendicant to wonder-working oddity may have resulted from the claims of some Sufi saints and their followers to miraculous powers.
Do people actually think of all this diversity as part of one religious tradition?
Walk into the nearest institution identified as a Hindu temple, and you know immediately that the answer to the question is yes. Especially outside of India, temples serve devotees from many denominations and sects and therefore include multiple images of the divine presence under one roof. Even in India, where temples typically serve constituencies somewhat less varied, most places of worship display prominent symbols of more than one denomination. Over the centuries, the many sources of religious imagery have come together to form the greater Hinduism as a result of several processes of integration.
Has meditation been an important ritual activity for Confucians?
Confucian tradition has generally emphasized the need for a calm, contemplative approach to life. Few individuals can develop the habit of reflection without engaging deliberately in practices designed to facilitate that habit. Meditation has not occupied as prominent a position in Confucian spirituality as it has in Chinese Buddhism, but it is important nevertheless. Confucians who engage in solitary or group meditation usually sit on small stools, rather than on the floor in the lotus posture, as many Buddhists do. When Confucians meditate, they reflect on the underlying propriety and order of the universe, cultivation of the ethical self for the purpose of contributing more conscientiously to society is the goal. Classical Confucian and Neo-Confucian writers describe meditation as quiet sitting and abiding in reverence. Unlike Zen meditation, Confucian meditation has a distinctly ethical emphasis. Some authors say the goal of meditation is to make a place in one's mind for the human beings who constitute one's own community, family, friends, associates. Not unlike a process of free association. This form of meditation gathers whatever comes to mind and allows it all to sift and settle naturally. Settled nature is the goal. A state in which the meditator is free from the agitation that arises from disordered relationships. Confucian meditation may sound quite unstructured, but it requires constant mental and emotional discipline. A meditator must be alert to abstract notions that distract from concrete ethical concerns. For it is often much easier to drift off into speculation than to confront life as one is actually living it.
What were some of the other regular festivals once associated with CIT?
Many of the religiously significant times acknowledged with rituals in sacred sites affiliated with CIT overlap with popular deist and CCT practices. The literati, who functioned as ritual specialists in service of the imperial house, generally looked down on deist and CCT devotionalism and often made fun of their beliefs. But as servants of the emperor, they could hardly afford to snub the very deities to whom the general populace prayed for success in mundane but important matters such as timely rain and abundant harvest. When the emperor's far-flung political administrators entered into their roles as religious ritualists, they often found themselves crossing an imaginary line from the elite to the everyday life of the locals. Celebrating days associated with deities of purely local or regional origin and importance remain the task of deists and practitioners of CCT. But when they paid homage to local or regional deities whom the emperor had elevated to the CIT pantheon, the literati were providing implicit legitimation for popular beliefs and practices. In addition to the birthday of Confucius on the 27th day of the 8th lunar month, CIT also celebrated new and full moon occasions, some of which coincided with feasts like that of Lao Zi, second month, day 15, and the Hungry Ghosts, 7th month, day 15.
Who is the Jade Emperor?
One of the more intriguing personalities in the deist and CCT pantheons is the Jade Emperor, Yu Huangdadi. His emergence as a power to be reckoned with in popular worship offers important insight into the dynamics of Chinese religion generally. During the 5th and 6th centuries, Yu Huangdadi was but one among many relatively minor deities. During the Tang dynasty of the 7th through 9th centuries, he gained prominence as a result of the appearance of a new text called the Jade Emperor Scripture, Yu Huangjing. It tells how centuries earlier a queen had dreamt that Taishang Daojun, second of the three pure ones, handed her an infant. She awoke and bore a child, who after a short time as a young prince, withdrew to mountain solitude. Lengthy spiritual discipline transformed the youth into the Jade Emperor. In the 10th century, a Song dynasty emperor named Zhenzong, r. 998-1022, chose Yu Huangdadi as his patron deity and spread word of an expected revelation that came in 1008 in the form of sacred scriptures, thus bolstering the weak emperor's position. Thereafter the Jade Emperor rose to the top of the popular pantheon, thus becoming the CEO of a divine bureaucracy. Stories like that of the Jade Emperor help to explain why enumerations of the deist and CCT pantheons are sometimes a bit confusing.
What is a Messiah?
Mashiach is a Hebrew word that means anointed one. Christos is the Greek equivalent. Anointing is an ancient Jewish ritual first used to consecrate the priesthood, and later to elevate Saul and David to kingly office. Expectation of the coming of a Messiah arose in Jewish tradition, especially during and after the Babylonian exile. Bereft of both temple and monarchy, Jews longed for a restoration of their former estate under the guidance of a descendant of David. For the next several centuries, various notions developed as to how one would recognize the Messiah when he appeared, but tradition did not arrive at a consensus. The Essene community evidently looked forward to two messiahs, one with spiritual and the other with political power. Protracted Roman occupation of Israel 2,000 years ago gave rise to renewed messianic expectation. One community of belief, now called Christianity, crystallized around Jesus. Convinced that he had all the necessary qualifications. Even so, the New Testament gives evidence of mixed opinions as to how people would know with certainty that Jesus was the Messiah. For Jews, messianic expectation did not end with Jesus. A century later, many Jews acclaimed Bar Kokhba as Messiah and rallied in support of his revolt. But the Romans quelled the uprising in 135 when they laid siege to the famous Dead Sea stronghold called Masada. Several significant claimants to messiahship have appeared since then, especially under Muslim rule and in medieval Europe, including David Menachem al-Rawi, 12th c. Kurdistan, David Rubani, DC 1538. Solomon Malko, 1500-32, Shabi Tizivai, 1626-76, and his successor in the movement, Jacob Frank, 1726-91. Some subcommunities of extremely Orthodox Jews have even more recently looked upon local leaders as messiahs. For the majority of Jews today, messianic expectation remains a minor article of faith. At most, Reform theology has spiritualized the concept, teaching that the advent of the Messiah is a purely personal event rather than one that will usher in a new age.
Is there such a thing as a Buddhist saint?
Nearly all of the Mahayana denominations look to special embodiments of holiness for guidance, inspiration, and even the occasional miracle. Japanese Buddhists call some of these figures shonin, an honorific designation bestowed especially on patriarchs and founders of lineages and denominations. A group called the 18 Lohans, Lohan is derived from the Sanskrit term Arhat, are set apart from the Buddha's earliest disciples as uniquely sacred because of their unselfish commitment to spreading the Dharma rather than retire into peaceful solitude. Theravada tradition still uses the term Arhat, worthy one, to refer to a living embodiment of sanctity and wisdom. But the Arhat remains an ethical model only, and a rather distant ideal at that. Mahayana teaching sees the Bodhisattva as the ultimate in human potential. Some even confer the title on living individuals, such as the Dalai Lama. Bodhisattvas not only model spiritual perfection, but function as mediators as well. As emissaries of the various Buddhas, they exercise saving power and make comforting grace available to all who ask.
Do Buddhists celebrate feast days of any other important religious figures?
In China, Japan, and Tibet especially, Buddhists hold feasts in honor of various bodhisattvas and holy persons. The death anniversary of Bodhidharma, traditionally believed to be the founding patriarch of Chinese Zen, occurs on the 5th day of the 10th lunar month, Bhadrapada, August/September. Events in the life of Tibetan Buddhism's important patriarch Padmasambhava provide a kind of narrative. Sacred structure for the entire year with special observances occurring on the 10th day of each lunar month. Devotees celebrate his flight from the world in the first month, his taking of religious vows in the second, and his miraculous transformation of fire into water during the third, for example. One of the most widely celebrated sacred persons is the Bodhisattva Guanyin, called Kannon in Japan. Her special day is the 19th of a given lunar month, with her birthday occurring during the second month. Her enlightenment during the 6th, and her entry into nirvana during the 9th.
Who is the Dalai Lama and why is he important to so many Buddhists?
The man known the world over as the Dalai Lama is the 14th in a series of sacred figures believed to be reincarnations of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara as well as of the preceding Dalai Lama. The original Dalai Lama was head of the Gelugpa order on whom a Mongol leader bestowed the title, which means teacher of ocean-wide wisdom. In 1578, Tenzin Gyatso is the current Dalai Lama and a monk of the Tibetan Gelugpa order. When the 13th Dalai Lama died, in 1933, officials of the order began investigations in search of his successor. They found 3 likely candidates, baby boys who manifested certain special signs. They chose Tenzin, born in 1935. And in 1940 brought him to the Potala Palace in Lhasa to begin his monastic life. His extensive training included studies in philosophy and the arcane scriptures of the Vajrayana tradition, as well as meditative disciplines. He learned the difficult skill of Tibetan ritual chanting, with its strikingly deep pitch and haunting overtones. Outsiders often find it difficult to understand why the monks would take a baby away from his family to sequester him for a life of spiritual discipline. Tibetans see it all as part of a much larger picture. A family could scarcely hope for a greater blessing. But the Dalai Lama's traditional role in Tibetan history has not always found him enjoying the serenity of monastic meditation. Dalai Lamas have traditionally been important political leaders in Tibet. When the Chinese invaded Tibet in 1950, they put increasing pressure on the Dalai Lama. He went into exile in India in 1959. From his headquarters in Dharamsala, His Holiness has continued to represent the cause of the oppressed Tibetan people. He has written several books that explain beautifully the genuinely open and universally tolerant teaching he espouses.
Are any occasions associated with Muhammad especially important?
Since medieval times, Muslims in many countries have celebrated Muhammad's birthday. Mawlid an-Nabi, on the 12th of Rabi'i. Street parties and grand banquets often provide opportunity for special prayers and speeches. A very popular part of the festivities is the recitation of a poem by the 13th century Egyptian poet Bizari, the Burda, pronounced Biyurda, mantle. Translated into Swahili and a number of other languages. The poem sings the Prophet's praises in truly cosmic terms, attributing to his birth all manner of marvels and blessings. In some places, where festivities are minimized or forbidden altogether, even the Prophet's birthday is a kind of national holiday. On the 27th of Rajab, Muslims recall the night journey and ascension, Laylat al-Isra wal Miraj. According to traditional accounts, the Prophet experienced this timeless mystical moment sometime during the years just before the Hijrah. A major feature of the celebrations is the retelling of any of several narratives that follow. Gabriel and Muhammad through the heavens, including descriptions of his meetings and conversations with the other major prophets, each associated with one of the 7 celestial levels. During the course of his journey, Muhammad received special instructions about instituting the 5 daily ritual prayers.
What do Buddhists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
One of the many issues the Buddha refused to speculate on was the existence or significance of gods. As a Hindu, he naturally learned the traditional stories of the divinities. As a man of his time, with all its religious and intellectual ferment, the Buddha questioned the wisdom of reliance on ritual sacrifice. He did not deny the existence of the gods. He merely insisted that whatever power the gods might possess, it could not solve the fundamental human dilemma. That remained the sole responsibility of the individual person. Many Buddhist sacred texts talk of the gods in mythic terms. It was, for example, the gods who made sure young Siddhartha Gautama encountered the 4 passing sights that turned his life around. But classical Buddhist teaching does not refer to an ultimate reality in personal terms. That changed as popular devotional forms of Buddhism developed, especially in China, Korea, and Japan. Buddha himself assumed virtually divine proportions, and the concept of the universal Buddha nature superseded that of the Buddha as historical human teacher. Gods of ancient Hindu myth retained a place in the Buddhist spiritual cosmos but remain very much in the background.
Is there such a thing as heresy in Islamic tradition?
Muslim tradition recognizes varying degrees of deviation from pure faith or iman, iman. Certain forms of departure from strict Quranic teaching and practices clearly identified as deriving from the Sunnah of the Prophet have been labeled innovation, bid'ah. Some things once considered innovations, such as attaching minarets to mosques, have long since become widely accepted. All but today's most traditionally minded Muslims give little consideration to this category. A daily danger for all human beings, one that Muslims seek to combat constantly, is called shirk, or associating partners with God. Any undue attention or attachment to that which is not God is thus a form of shirk. But while it is a natural tendency, it is not necessarily a permanent condition unless one chooses to make it so. A more serious problem, known technically as deviation, ilhad, comes closer to what many understand by the term heresy. A mulhid is someone who deliberately strays from the broadly accepted tenets of the faith, introducing innovations to the extent that one can no longer readily recognize basic Islamic teachings in the new formulation. Farthest from adherence to true belief is the category of kafir, the kind of willful unbelief that leads to outright blasphemy.
Why do Jews, Christians, and Muslims all claim the same Holy Land?
Palestine lies in Southwest Asia at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. It is the Holy Land of Jews, since it was here that Moses led the Israelites after he led them out of slavery in Egypt and where they subsequently established their homeland, of Christians. Since it is where Jesus Christ was born, lived, and died, and of Muslims. Since the Arab people conquered Palestine in the 7th century and, except for a brief period during the Crusades, it was ruled by various Muslim dynasties until 1516, when it became part of the Ottoman Empire. Palestine, which covers an area of just over 10,000 square miles, is roughly the size of Maryland. Palestine's capital, Jerusalem, is also claimed as a holy city by all three religions. Jews call it the City of David, or the City of the Great King, since it was made the capital of the ancient kingdom of Israel around 1000 BCE. Christians regard it as holy since Jesus traveled with his disciples to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. It is the site of the Last Supper, and just outside the city, at Golgotha, Jesus was crucified, c. 30. Muslim Arabs captured the city in 638, just after Muhammad's death. And, like the rest of Palestine, it has a long history of Muslim Arab rule. Jerusalem, which is now part of the modern state of Israel, is home to numerous synagogues, churches, and mosques. It also has been the site of numerous religious conflicts throughout history.
Do Buddhists believe in angels?
Buddhist popular belief inherited and retained many of the different types of celestial and semi-divine beings that populated Hindu myth. Nearly all Hindu deities have their personal attendants. In addition, a variety of other spiritual presences fill the heavenly and earthly realms. Artists often depict these characters as floating gracefully, but they generally lack the wings most people associate with angels. A class of being called apsaras, Sanskrit for moving in water, are the most numerous of these denizens of the intermediate realm. Early Buddhist artists sometimes depicted apsaras as devotees worshipping the Buddha's footprints or gathered around the tree of enlightenment. Another group, called the Gandharvas, were Hindu demigods who entertained the deities as musicians and dancers. Buddhist tradition retained them in that capacity. The classic angelic function of guardianship and protection resides in other classes of beings regarded as gods in some sects. Lokapalas, world guardians, are those who stand watch over the four quarters of the universe. Many Buddhist temples depict them as muscular, heavily armed gatekeepers. The Dharmapalas, guardians of the teaching, are a band of fearsome deities whose task is to guard believers, especially in Vajrayana. As a kind of personal deity assigned to each individual, these protectors can take on either benevolent or angry form, depending on whether they are dealing with a believer or with an enemy of the faith.